Hi there, Professor Hahn here with the recapitulation of Chapter 12, The Cold War Begins. Uh, you have to understand the mindset of the Soviets. They're a very paranoid group of people. Now, in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Reds were fighting the Whites. The Red Russians were the communists, the Whites were the group that had overthrown the czar 6 months earlier. They were capitalists. They were former military leaders. And the United States actually deployed troops into Russia to support the whites against the communist revolution. So the communists already have a reason for not liking the United States. Then, on top of that, the United States drags its feet in recognizing the communist government of the Soviet Union. They don't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. So there's already, and communism is based on the overthrow of capitalism, and the United States is a country uh, heavily capitalistic. So there's all kinds of reasons why the Soviets would not trust us, would not like us. This disdain continued to grow as the Soviets needed an enemy to help, in their mind, consolidate their control over the Soviet people. Whatever problem was perceived in the local area uh, among the Soviet citizens, it was based on something that was the United States' fault. Uh, the tone of post-war relations between the Soviet Union and the United States kind of got its beginning during the war as the United States captured Italy. Italy had a fleet, not big, but they had a fleet, a bunch of Navy ships. And the Soviets wanted those ships. The Americans didn't even invite the Soviets to the table when the Americans and the Brits met to discuss what they were going to do with Italy and how they were going to control it in the after their surrender. The Soviets were completely out of the loop here, and the Soviets took note of that. And so, as they conquered Eastern Europe, driving the Nazis back towards Berlin, they took over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and they didn't allow the U.S. to have much of a role at all in any of these uh, regions after the Russians took over. Indeed, the Polish government was actually the Polish government from before the war was living in exile in London and had every expectation that as soon as Poland was liberated from the Germans, that they would be allowed to come back and reconstitute their control over the Polish countryside. Not to be. The Soviets had their own puppet government established, the Lublin government, and they put that government in charge of Poland, and they made Poland a communist state. The Soviets tightly controlled communications within their boundaries to the point of jamming electronic signals from radio stations from the West that were beaming in uh, programming designed to make the Soviets look bad in the eyes of the Soviet population. Um, they also they also cranked down on the ability of any Soviet citizens to travel very far outside of their villages. Um, the fear was that these people would travel to the West, and the Soviets didn't want there to be a big desertion of population to the Western world. Opposition in the Soviet Union was either killed outright or chased into exile. So this set the stage for confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. A long telegram came about when the Soviet Union was not working well with the looking for the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF was wondering, what's going on in Russia? Why aren't they contributing? They are, after all, a victor in the Second World War. They're a massive country. Surely they have the assets available to help us out rebuilding some of these smaller countries. And the fact of the matter is, the Soviets did not. The Soviets were little better than your smallest, most remote country on the earth. They had very little infrastructure, very little industry, very little capability. Now, Soviets did tend to crank down on members of other embassies traveling around their countryside. We did the same thing to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Soviet diplomats and members of their technical staff could not readily leave Washington, D.C., and certainly could not travel down around military bases around the country. And they were spied on, they were tracked, as the Soviets did to our citizens. If you walked out of the embassy in Moscow or the consulate in Leningrad, you were followed by what they called a millie man, a militia man, who was basically a cop who watched you. And if you did something he thought suspicious, would get on the phone to their higher ups, and you would be quickly rounded up and taken in for questioning. In 1946, the ambassador to the Soviet Union has left post and returned to the States. His replacement has not yet arrived when the State Department sends a telegram to the embassy asking for information. In charge in Moscow is George F. Kennan. Kennan is the charge d'affaires. Now, a charge d'affaires is the number two guy in the embassy who is temporarily appointed as the number one guy in that guy's absence. So, an ambassador leaves, the deputy chief of mission, who is the number two man or woman, takes over and sends a letter to the local government announcing that he is functioning as charge d'affaires for the country he represents, in charge of affairs. And the host government usually will accept that, and the two countries can continue to conduct affairs back and forth, intergovernmental affairs. Now, it's called the Long Telegram, and this is George Kennan's response to this request for information. Now, George Kennan had traveled around the Soviet Union. He was an expert, or as much of an expert as any American could be, on the Soviet Union. And so he traveled around and he knew what the countryside was like. Now, it's called the Long Telegram because it was a really long telegram. Telegrams were normally very short. Remember, these things had to be sent by Morse code. And you did a lot of abbreviation of words. You made comments. Instead of writing a paragraph, you condensed it down to a sentence. And you made these things as short and easy to transmit as you could. Not Kennan. Kennan wrote a long telegram. And in the telegram, he tells the State Department what the Soviet Union is like, really. He talks about these little villages that have no central plumbing or central water supply. Everybody goes to the village well, and women carry poles across their shoulders with buckets on either end. And he talks about how undeveloped and underdeveloped the countryside is. Paints the picture of a country as a very poor, technologically challenged country. He suggested that to confront the Soviets, you don't need to do so with outright conflict, but rather you can contain the Soviet Union by meeting them at every instance where they try to influence another country with counter offer, so to speak. Uh, the Congo wants to buy a bunch of tractors from the Soviet Union. The U.S. comes in and says, here's our tractor. We'll give you the same number and it'll cost you a lot less. And all we want in exchange is your support in the United Nations. Um, we want your friendship. And this becomes a regular thing throughout the entire Cold War period. And I think I mentioned this in the points to consider. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, our ambassador made the comment that all of our aid programs would probably dry up because there was no Soviet threat to counter any longer. In any case, the idea of the policy of containment was articulated in this long telegram, and it was endorsed and accepted by the American government, and it became the cornerstone of our policy with all nations around the world from then until the fall of the Soviet Union. We will give you foreign aid, we will spend money in your country, we will assist you, and all we hope is that you will stay within our orbit and support American policies and American commitments. Um, so this this became the cornerstone of American foreign policy. In 1993, I was back in the States, had just returned from Africa, and I remember watching a TV show. George Kennan was on TV. Now he's an old man. At that point, he was an old man. And he's basically saying that the Soviet Union, which had just collapsed after 45 years since he made the containment policy, named the containment policy, it didn't take 50 years, it only took 45, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And he was having fun saying, I told you so. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Now, this was a commencement exercise that he was the guest speaker at in Westminster. And basically, what he said was that, where's the quote here? From Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And what he's articulating here is the idea that the Soviets have shut down communications and travel and trade with Eastern Europe. Won't let the people out, won't let us Westerners in, is tightly controlling information flow, and is actively killing people who are trying to escape. So this is where the term Iron Curtain came from. And the term Iron Curtain was used to collectively refer to to Eastern Europe, to all of those countries that were part of the Soviet orbit. The Soviet had held those countries after the war because they wanted a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. It was far better if land was going to be bombed to have Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria bombed instead of the Soviet Union. Excuse me, got the hiccups here. The Truman Doctrine came about at the end of the Second World War. A couple of things are going on. First off, the Soviet Union has very little access to year-round ice-free ports. Most of the northern boundary of the Soviet Union is on the Arctic Sea, but for the most part, that's frozen over almost year-round. And they have one warm water port in Murmansk, which is in the upper northwestern part of the country. This is where the Gulf Stream, that stream of water that goes along the Atlantic coast of the United States, crosses over in the in the very top of the North Atlantic and empties into this region, and it enough warm water left to cut down on the amount of ice in that particular port. Of course, you've got ice-free ports on the Pacific coast, but the Soviet Union does not have a good infrastructure of transporting goods from eastern ports to their population centers and their government centers in the West. So they do have they have a lot of port area on the Black Sea, which is a warm water port. But to get from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, you have to go through the Bosporus Straits and the Dardanelles Straits. And those are controlled by Turkey. And Turkey is a pro-Western country. So the Soviets would very much like to have control of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. They view Greece as a stepping stone. If they can gain control of Greece, it will be very easy to move eastward into Turkey and take it over. So that's the Soviet mindset. And the British mindset, well, that's important because the Brits have been controlling Greece since Greece was rescued from the Nazis. And at the end of the war, the British decided, we're done. We're tired of war. We're going to go home. And if you other countries care about these areas, go ahead and do whatever you want, but we're out of here. They abandoned Greece. They also abandoned Palestine, which we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about the growth of Israel. Okay, the Americans decide to step in. And the way we step in is by providing this very youthful Greek army that had only been formed in the last year or so as Greece was liberated from Nazi control. And we had lots of equipment. We had all those trucks and tanks and rifles and other bombs and equipment, ammunition that we had made for World War II that we no longer needed because the war was over. So the U.S. deploys advisors to Greece to train the Greeks on how to use these weapons and how to use all this equipment, and to help them fight this communist insurgency. These communists that are coming down from Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and are trying to take over Greece. If you've traveled on Interstate 4 coming down from Orlando towards Lakeland, you'll notice a sign for the Van Fleet bicycle path, I guess it is. Basically, it's the old railroad right of way, which was paved over, and people can now run on this path and they can ride bicycles on this path. James Van Fleet was the commanding general in charge of these troops in Greece after the war. Now, out of this insurgency in Greece grew the Truman Doctrine. So we're back to the original question: what was the Truman Doctrine? Truman Doctrine basically was Harry Truman's statement that, let me get the quote here, it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. So you've got an insurgency developing in the northern part of the country, a communist insurgency. And here's Truman going on record and saying, it's my doctrine, it's my policy, the policy of the United States of America, that we will assist these countries when they have problems with external pressures. Well, that kind of sets the stage for the U.S. getting involved in a lot of nonsense for the next 40, 50 years. And this becomes an added stone, an added brick on this new cornerstone of American foreign policy. The Marshall Plan was a plan to bail out Europe because of the utter destruction and devastation of the war. Now, during the war, a lot of the cities and industries were bombed out. Artillery fire, aircraft bomber fire, tanks, troops moving through an area, anything that was useful was destroyed. And so there was most of industry in Central Europe was toast, and their farmers' fields were filled with a lot of unexpended ordnance or ordnance that had fallen to the earth but did not explode, what we call duds. A farmer running a horse plow through a field could have his iron plow blade strike a bomb that was submerged below the dirt and unintentionally make the bomb work the way it's supposed to. And the explosion sends the horse, the farmer, and the plow flying apart in various pieces, making it very difficult to farm those lands. Now, the U.S. The U.S. usually has pretty good crops. The North American continent is well watered. The European continent, when you think of Europe, think more in terms of Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, where it rains a lot. Now, there are no mountain ranges to squeeze the moisture out of these clouds in Europe like there are in the Western United States. So Europe tends to get an awful lot of water, an awful lot of rain, and too much rain ruins the crops in the field. So here we come into 1948, and Europe is starving. People are down to 1,200 calories a day. They can't find enough food to eat. And along comes the United States in the form of the Marshall Plan, which was named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall. The idea was take a bunch of money, make it available to European nations. The money can be used to purchase food from U.S. farmers, and the money can be used to purchase tractors and trucks from U.S. industry. The initial outlay of $5 billion soon grew to $13 billion and grew even higher as the period of the Marshall Plan lasted. Some 16 countries initially took part in the Marshall Plan. Interestingly enough, none of these were communist countries. The Soviet Union quickly let it be known to all of the communist countries that they were not to take American Marshall Plan aid, and the Soviet Union themselves did not take it. This helped foster the idea that the U.S. are the bad people. Why aren't they here rescuing us? The people didn't know that their own government was keeping them from reaping the benefits of this aid. Europe became divided because of the communist philosophy and the capitalist philosophy. The Soviets steamrolled in from Moscow and Stalingrad, taking over all of these Eastern European countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Albania, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria. I may have mentioned one or two of those twice, but anyway, you get the general idea. The U.S., meantime, and the British took over France and came in and liberated Italy and protected Switzerland's neutrality and took over Austria. And you ended up with a one side communist, one side free Western. And as the Soviets departed, as they pulled back and started to demobilize their massive wartime army, these people went into private homes and stole everything that they could: toilets, electrical wiring, sinks, all of the things that they could use back at their own homes. And the biggest problem for the Soviets was a massive flood of people out of these areas that the Soviets controlled into the free Western areas of France and Western Germany and what have you, all those others that I mentioned. So the Soviets decided to erect walls, and initially they erected fences and they put in minefields and they put in soldiers to guard the fences and to shoot at people that tried to escape. Later on, they built actual walls and topped them with electrified fences to make sure that all these people would stay in communist controlled lands to enjoy the much better lifestyle that they all had. They jammed the radio signals so that these people could not learn what it was really like in the West. And their propaganda machines, the Soviet propaganda machines, of course, made it sound like Americans ate babies and shot grandmas, stuff like that. The Berlin airlift was a response to Soviet overstepping the agreements that divided Europe. Germany was divided into four sectors. The French had one, the British had one, the Americans had one, and the Soviets controlled one. Soviets controlled Eastern Germany. The British controlled of the Western 2/3. The British controlled the northern sector. The French controlled the western sectors, and the United States controlled the southern sectors. There were highways that went from the western part of Germany into eastern Germany to the former German capital of Berlin. Berlin had also similarly been divided into four sectors. The Soviets had the eastern sector, the British, French, and Americans the western parts of the city. Now, that's fine. There was an agreement between all four of the big powers, the big four, that they would jointly control the Germans. They were afraid of Germany resurging after their loss of the war. And West or Berlin was completely enclosed inside the Soviet sector of Eastern Germany. Okay, that means that their reservoirs, which provided water for those living in the western part of the city, actually were outside of the city in the Soviet controlled sectors. The Soviets cut off access to fresh water. Electrical plants were outside of the downtown area, the sectors controlled by the British, French, and Americans. And so the Soviets were able to come in and shut down those plants, or at least shut down power to the wires going into Western Berlin. About 2 million people faced starvation. The Soviet intent was to convince the West to leave Western Berlin, and the Soviets would move in, take it all over, and there would be no Westerners inside the Soviet controlled sector. Nice idea, except that it failed in execution because they could not really control the airspace. And the U.S. let it be known by stationing bombers and fighters nearby that any attempt to shoot down our cargo aircraft would be met with fire. And then they began a big, massive airlift from Western German air bases, England, Western France, uh, other areas, of bringing in, well, food, water, generators, um, things that the people needed, clothing, blankets, firewood, oil, things that people needed in order to survive through the winter months. Over 2.3 million tons of supplies were delivered in over 277,000 flights. Now, these aircraft that they used were C-54s and C-47s. Now, if you want to know what a C-47 is, if you've ever traveled on I-4 and traveled past Fantasy of Flight, down around exit 44, I think it's between 41 and 44, that big cargo airplane, or big, actually a small cargo airplane, but that airplane that's up on the pedestal is a C-47. The C-54 was slightly larger. It had 4 engines, and these airplanes came from the Royal New Zealand Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Royal Air Force of Great Britain, um, the United States Air Force, the South Africans even got involved and sent cargo aircraft up. And these planes continued their flight. They had a corridor to go in and a corridor to come out to the two air bases inside of Western Germany. The West actually built a third air base in West Berlin, and there was an airplane landing about every 3 minutes uh, throughout this period from 24 June to 12 May, almost a year. After after a year, the Soviets blinked. They realized that they couldn't win this argument, and so they relaxed the standards. They didn't want to drive the U.S. into opening a corridor to the western part of Berlin, and so they finally stopped blocking the highways, and the airlift came to an end. But with the end of the airlift also ended any pretense of these nations getting together to control Germany. And what happened is in 1949, the Western German sectors, the French, British, and American, are all combined into a new German republic called the Federated Republic or the Federal Republic of Germany. And colloquially, it was known as West Germany. And of course, the Democratic Republic of Germany, the eastern part, became East Germany. And that's how people from throughout the Cold War referred to those two countries. It's not till the fall of the Berlin Wall in the early 1990s that Germany is finally reunited into the country that it is today. Okay, formation of the State of Israel. Now, Palestine had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and at the end of the First World War, uh, the Ottoman Empire was broken up. The main central part of the Ottoman Empire became the country of Turkey, and the other little regions and states around the Eastern Mediterranean were divided up between France and Great Britain and given to them to control as League of Nations mandates. Now, the League of Nations, of course, only existed between the two world wars. After the war, the United Nations took over those functions as a new organization. And but during the interwar period there between the first and the second, you had France controlling Syria uh, and Lebanon, Great Britain controlling Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And when the British decided that they were done with Greece, they also decided they were done with Palestine. And so you saw the British presence being reduced to where they finally everybody gets on a boat and leaves. And you had two groups living there. You had the Jews who had been there all along, and you had the Palestinians who had been there all along. And they kind of got together. The area was known collectively as Palestine. You had Jewish communities, Jewish settlements. You had Arab communities, Arab settlements. You had the synagogues of the Jews. You had the mosques of the Muslims. Um, and everybody seemed to get along all right. The Zionist group that created the state of Israel, um, they put together a government, and on the 14th of May in 1948, they declared their independence. Now, in Europe, you've had two-thirds of the Jewish population liquidated by Hitler in his final solution. And you've only got about a third of the pre-war Jews still living, most of them in concentration camps, some on the way to the concentration camps to be gassed, to be killed. There were trainloads of Jews that were accidentally bombed by the Allies as they bombed Germany. And of course, a pilot flying overhead sees a bunch of civilians erupting from the sides of a train. He can pretty much guess that that's not a military target and stop bombing it. But still, there was destruction. There were Jews that were accidentally killed in their liberation, so to speak, and there were Jews that were still in hiding at the end of the war. Not very many, but the problem was you had this massive humanitarian crisis. What to do with those Jews? And the decision was made among the Jews. Let's go to Palestine. That's our homeland. Jews traditionally came from that area, had been chased out by Hammurabi and the various groups that inhabited the Fertile Crescent back in antiquity. The Egyptians certainly had them enslaved for a period of time. And there had been this great diaspora of Jews. The traditional toast on the Jewish New Year was next year in Jerusalem. They all harbored visions of returning to Palestine, the land of their forefathers. And now here was an opportunity. And the Jews living in Palestine saw this as a good thing because that would help them increase the Jewish population and help them to be able to control larger tracts of land. Palestinians hated the idea because they saw this massive inswell of people from Europe as taking over their land and depriving them of the benefits of that land. Kind of like what we've got going on the southern border right now with Americans saying, we don't want these people coming in. They'll take up jobs from Americans and they'll change the voting dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. The day after Israel declared its independence, the Arabs struck. Palestinians attacked Jewish settlements, and Jewish armies from Syria and Jordan invaded, and some from Egypt invaded into Israel. And the Israelis proved to be a little bit more tenacious than the Palestinians imagined. And they were able to drive back the Arabs, and the UN brokered a ceasefire. And as a result, Israel is divided into 6 regions. 3 are Palestinian, 3 are Jewish. Now, I go into a lot more on Palestine in a future chapter, so I'm going to leave Palestine at this point, just to say that the Jewish state is created, and the creationist Jewish state gives a reason for the current Arab Western difficulties that exist. The terrorist attacks going back to the mid 60s, mid 50s, and early 60s, all stem from Palestinian outrage over the creation of Israel. And the Palestinian organizations, many of them today, do not favor the existence of Israel and would do everything they could to destroy Israel, kill all the Jews. Okay, setbacks to U.S. policy in the late 40s. You had some setbacks, you had some good things. Probably a good thing is the formation of the Federal Republic of Germany, allowing the Germans to retake control of their own area, develop their industries, and they have, in fact, developed one of the strongest economies in Europe today. So this was a good thing. Okay, another good thing was the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, NATO was created as a military and political, but mostly military, headquarters of Western allied nations who would provide military units to NATO in the event that NATO had to confront a Soviet invasion. Initially, it was mostly a political structure. There was a command military structure there, but there weren't a lot of troops. Truman did not want to build a big deployed presence of U.S. troops. He had just demobilized the military, and he did not want to create conditions that might lead to another conflict. So, what did he do? He created conditions that led to another conflict. What he did is he pulled all the money out of the military, and he cut the size of the military to the point where the military was incapable of defending any areas. And the biggest area that this will influence is coming up in our discussion, our initial discussion of the Korean conflict. Okay, now setbacks to U.S. policy is in 1949, the long civil war in China between the communists and the nationalists comes to an end as the nationalists are driven off of mainland China. They escape to the island of Formosa off the coast of China. And today you also know it as the island of Taiwan, the nation of Taiwan. It's actually the Republic of China, is what they call themselves, the ROC. And they are a pro Western Chinese population. It's not just Formosa. There are several other islands that you'll hear about as we go through this course that also are part of the nationalist government. The communist government is established, and the U.S. views this with alarm because the population of China, well, let's face it, today, China consists of 1/5 of the world's population. And the fact that 1/5 of the population is anti American is something for Americans to be concerned about. Now, the other big thing in 1949 is that the Soviet Union explodes an atomic bomb. First one. So, the Soviet Union is nuclear. China is now a communist country with 1/5 of the world's population. And the U.S. is being run by a president that doesn't really want to get involved uh, in any major confrontation against those two powers. NSC 68, the National Security Council, is a governmental organization comprised of leaders from various government agencies. And these are all experts in foreign affairs and in what's going on in the various regions of the nation. And they are an advisory group to the president. They issue their advice through memorandums, and NSC 68 or NSC Memorandum 68 is one such document where, for the first time, the Soviet Union is actually named as the enemy of the United States. It formalizes the policy of containment. It's yet another building block added onto the long telegram and the Truman Doctrine. And although the NSC 68 remains classified till the mid 70s, nevertheless, this is the guidance that the nation conducts its foreign policies and its foreign affairs with different nations, all always in the context of how can you help me against the Soviet Union and then later China. Uh, the impact of North Korea's invasion on South Korea in 1950 kind of negated Truman's ideas with regard to NSC 68 because NSC 68 advised the president to maintain a large standing army in Europe and in other hotspots around the world, including Japan and Korea, and suggested a large military presence. But Truman had just demobilized the military. He didn't want a large government expenditure on the military. So he decided not to go by everything that NSC 68 advised. And of course, in 1950, in the summer, late spring, early summer of 1950, the world wakes up to the North Korean army invading South Korea. Now, where did North Korea come from? Korea had been controlled by Japan since before World War II, certainly during World War II. And on August 9th, the day the U.S. dropped their second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki, the Soviets immediately declared war on Japan and sent troops into Mongolia, but also into North Korea. So after the Japanese surrender, North Korea and South Korea uh, are separated with a communist inspired country in the north and a free pro West government in the south. The problem for the Koreans is the northern land is mostly mountainous. Southern land is more alluvial plain, more conducive to agriculture. You can build an industry, but it's awfully hard to grow rice on a mountainside. And so the North Koreans felt they needed the South. They still do. They needed the South to be able to feed their own populations. The North Koreans are still, to this day, the average North Korean is smaller, lighter, and more malnourished than the average South Korean. The average South Korean is looking more and more Western every day with the Western diets and the access to Western foods. So North Korea invades. Now, the U.S. Army, its commander had left the day before the invasion, not knowing what was coming. And the North Koreans had been massing troops along the border for quite some time. The U.S. had troops there, but not much equipment, very little training, and their main leaders just left the country. Uh, the North Koreans steamroll southward and drive the army, the U.S. Army troops, and the Republic of Korea, the South Korean troops before it, down to the bottom southwestern corner of the country. I go into South Korean war more in the next chapter, so I'm going to leave the discussion there, except to tell you that the impact of the northern invasion of the South was that Truman decided, oh, you guys in the National Security Council were right. We need a massive military presence to counter the Soviets around the world. He begins building up a big military presence in Korea, and he begins deploying a large military presence over to Western Germany. The domestic impact of the post-war demobilization on women and minorities. Well, as you can imagine, although a war was fought uh, in Europe, in America, this racial divide between Americans has not gotten any better. Because so many white men went off to fight the war, blacks were able to come in and backfill those positions in industries. But at the end of the war, when the soldiers came home, those soldiers came home to being released from the military. They had to have jobs. And so the factories started laying off their minority workers and hiring their Anglo-European workers. So there was a big economic step backwards for Black America. For women, there is an economic step back. But for the women, you've got a situation here where uh, a lot of eligible men were off fighting the war and they were single. And when they come home, here are potential husbands. And when the men come home, they're tired of the privations of combat and living in male dominated cloistered situations. They want the ladies. And so you see the marriage rate climb, and you see the women coming out of the factories and getting married and making babies. You have a massive baby boom from 1946 into the 60s. The baby boom takes up that period, and families are cranking out babies at a rather prodigious rate. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 52 after my father returned from the Korean conflict. So for women, they lost, they took a step backwards economically, but they married and they had family units. And this kind of took the place of the workplace in their responsibilities to their families. So anyway, that was the domestic impact of the post-war demobilization. Truman's domestic policies and Taft-Hartley. Now, labor unions, after as they were developed in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, they used strikes and the threat of strikes to gain a lot of control over the labor sector, over the industrial sector. And they established within a lot of these companies closed shops. Now, a closed shop is where you cannot apply for a job with a company unless you know somebody in that company who will vouch for you and say you're a good worker and you'll be a good, loyal union member. And that was the only way you could get jobs in a lot of these industries. My dad, the only way he got a job was by his father vouching for him. My grandfather and my father both were railroad engineers. I had no desire to be a railroad engineer. I had a desire to get an education and become a teacher. I don't know if that's your gain or your loss, but in any case, that's what closed shops were all about. Collective bargaining agreements. The labor unions grabbed control over all of the industries with their collective bargaining agreements, where a strike in one area, you could have labor unions in another area walk out of their jobs in sympathy with this business in this town that was on strike. Collective bargaining meant that the union bargained for all of these people. And of course, with this amount of control over these people, these laborers paid dues to belong to the union. And union members got very, very rich and very, very powerful. And labor unions could control the narrative in the news. They could control a lot of different things. An awful lot, I would say, an inordinate amount of control over industry and over the capitalist system. And Taft-Hartley, which was passed over Truman's veto, by the way. Congress by this time is controlled by the Republicans. And so they were able to overturn the Democratic president, President Truman's policy in this Taft-Hartley Act. So they banned closed shops. They prevented industry-wide collective bargaining, and they legalized state-sponsored right-to-work laws. Now, what is a right-to-work law? Florida is a right-to-work state. That means I can go apply for a job and I don't have to join their union if it is a union job. I apply it, the human resources part of the company, the branch hires me, and I tell the union, I don't want to belong to you. I'm not going to pay your dues. You don't speak for me, I'll speak for myself. And you can do this in right to work states. So this was a step backwards for labor unions. And to be honest, after 47, labor unions began to lose a lot of their power. Labor unions are nowhere near as big today, percentage wise, as they were back before Taft-Hartley. Truman's Fair Deal. Now, I did not have a slide on Truman's Fair Deal in the presentation. I've added it this morning when I realized, holy mackerel, I have the question, but I don't have any learning materials on it. So here's what Truman's Fair Deal is. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. Truman had the Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal basically was his policy where he wanted to everybody to have health insurance, universal health insurance. He also wanted to increase minimum wage, and he wanted equal rights in the hiring processes and not people barring those of a different religion or a different race from working in a company. The Congress, as I said, did not support Truman and a lot of his post-war policies, Congress pushed back against universal health insurance. Now, universal health insurance, the only time it's ever really been pushed through and won was Obamacare. And then when Trump took over afterwards, he got rid of the mandates that required Americans to purchase Obamacare. He got rid of those mandates. And of course, that gutted the free medical care for the poor people because the rich people didn't want to pay for somebody else's medical care. So we still don't have a universal health insurance. Um, how you feel about that is up to you. I've had health insurance my entire life. I'm not concerned about it. Um, Earlier legislation passed by the Congress in 46 protected the civil rights in the hiring process. Congress had already done that, so they didn't feel like they needed to be supportive of Truman's uh, policies and programs that he was trying to push through with the Fair Deal. Congress did support a higher minimum wage, however, so that was a good thing. Finally, the Red Scare. Well, this was Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy and his attempt to expose communists in the American government. And he went on a terrific witch hunt, going after people who uh, he suspected of having communist sympathies and ruining their careers. A lot of times without any proof, just on hearsay and anecdotal evidence. The Red Scare really dominated the news cycle in the late 40s and early 50s, and was aided by the communist incursion in North Korea to an extent. In that, see, that Joe McCarthy could point to that and say, see, the communists are trying to take over. It really took off in Hollywood, where they went after actors and actresses. I guess actresses is no longer a politically correct term, so it went after male and female actors. Even Lucille Ball, I Love Lucy, was attacked. Um, and her husband, Desi Arnaz, went before the committee and said the only thing red about Lucy is the color of her hair, and even that came out of a bottle. And of course, everybody laughed. Lucille Ball had been born a dark-haired girl, and then dyed her hair blonde when she first went to Hollywood, and then dyed it red later because it became part of her act. Uh, Joe McCarthy will go after the Army, and when he does that, everybody turns against him. And so finally, the Red Scare will peter out in 53, 54, and it'll be over. And Joe McCarthy will not survive very long after that. So this is the recapitulation of Chapter 12. As always, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to give me a call or send me a text or send me an email. If you have a question, you know the old saying, the stupidest question is the question not asked. 5 other students may have the same question, and you are the only one that articulates it. Please ask your question. Let me respond to it. And a lot of times I send my responses out to the entire class as an email so that everybody gets to know about it. So this is it for Chapter 12. I'll see you in Chapter 13. Go forth, do good, study hard, and we'll talk to you soon.